Maria Elena Vasquez had just spent her last $500 on 73 acres of worthless desert that everyone said was crazy to buy. Standing on the courthouse steps with the deed in her trembling hands, the single mother had no idea she was holding what would become a $140 million discovery. But first, she had to survive what everyone called the biggest mistake of her life. "You bought what?" Her sister Carmen's voice had cracked through the phone 2 weeks earlier, disbelief bleeding into something harder, something that cut deeper than Maria had expected. "Mija, please tell me you didn't throw away our mother's insurance money on some desert wasteland." If you're enjoying Maria's incredible journey from desperate single mother to desert treasure hunter, this story gets even more amazing. Hit that like button if you want to see how her impossible gamble pays off, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories that will blow your mind. But Maria had done exactly that. Standing now in the oppressive heat, watching the courthouse doors swing shut behind her with a finality that made her stomach lurch, she wondered if Carmen had been right, if everyone had been right. The real estate agent had barely suppressed his laughter when she'd signed the papers, his expensive suit and manicured nails a stark contrast to her discount store dress and hands that bore the permanent stains of grease and coffee. He'd called it distressed property, with the kind of smile that suggested he was doing her a favor by taking her money at all. The 73 acres of desert wasteland sat 47 miles northeast of Tucson. The county assessor had valued it at $200, which should have been Maria's first warning. Instead, she'd seen opportunity where others saw desolation. "Mama's gone loco," she'd heard Diego whisper to his friend Carlos during a sleepover, his voice carrying through the thin apartment walls with devastating clarity. At 8 years old, her son was already learning to be ashamed of her dreams. The thought had kept her awake that night, staring at the water-stained ceiling while the neighbors upstairs argued about money, and the couple next door played their television too loud, filling the darkness with canned laughter that felt like mockery. Her mother's words echoed in her memory. "They see possibilities where we see problems." When her mother passed, Maria had made a decision that shocked everyone. She'd seen something in that desert no one else could see. Water. Not on the surface. God knew there wasn't a drop of moisture visible anywhere on that baked landscape. Her grandfather's stories about sensing underground water had stayed with her. Standing in the desert for the first time, Maria had felt something her rational mind couldn't explain. A certainty that water ran deep beneath her feet, waiting to be discovered. The realtor had warned her about the drilling costs, the permitting requirements, the astronomical odds against finding anything more than dry rock and disappointment. But Maria had signed the papers anyway, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "They see possibilities where we see problems." 2 weeks later, everything was falling apart. The drilling had failed, equipment was stuck, and Maria faced losing not just her money, but Elena's retirement savings too. This was the moment when dreams either died or transformed into something extraordinary. The permit application for well drilling sat on her kitchen counter, requiring fees that would consume another month's worth of double shifts. The neighbors in her apartment complex had started referring to her purchase as Maria's Folly, with the kind of pitying amusement reserved for people who'd clearly lost their minds. Even Diego had started asking careful questions about money, his 8-year-old instincts picking up on the tension that followed her like a shadow. "Mrs. Rodriguez thinks you should have bought a car instead," he'd mentioned casually over breakfast, not looking up from his cereal. Mrs. Rodriguez was their upstairs neighbor, a woman who'd appointed herself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood common sense. "She says desert land ain't worth nothing unless you're planning to die on it." Maria had stirred her coffee slowly, buying time while she searched for words that wouldn't sound like lies. "Mrs. Rodriguez has never owned land, mijo. Sometimes people who have never had something don't understand what it means to want it." That night, Maria wondered if everyone was right about her foolish dream. The desert offered no reassurance, just endless silence and her growing doubts. But then, as the sun reached its merciless peak and the heat began to distort the horizon into wavering mirages, Maria knelt and pressed her palm against the cracked earth. The ground was furnace hot, burning through her thin cotton dress, but she'd held the position until her grandfather's voice came back to her across the decades. La tierra habla, mija. The earth speaks to those who know how to listen. Beneath her hand, the desert felt different than it looked. Where her eyes saw only barren hardpan, her touch detected something else. A subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, like the distant rumble of a freight train traveling through bedrock. Water, moving through hidden channels carved by millennia of flash floods and geological patience. Not surface water, which would have been impossible in this climate, but something deeper, older, part of an underground system that connected distant mountain ranges to ancient lake beds that existed now only in the memories of stones. Maria had driven home that day with dirt under her fingernails and a conviction that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. That night, she'd called 3 different well drilling companies, enduring the barely concealed skepticism in their voices as they quoted prices that made her stomach clench. The cheapest estimate was $12,000, money she didn't have, couldn't borrow, and had no realistic way of earning in the foreseeable future. But Maria had written down every number, every detail, every condition, filling a notebook with calculations that looked impossible on paper, but felt inevitable in her heart. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Elena Morales, a regular customer, had overheard her discussing the drilling costs. "You're serious about this water thing," Elena had said later, lingering over her coffee while the restaurant emptied around them. "It wasn't a question." "Everyone thinks I'm crazy," Maria had replied, refilling Elena's cup with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and caffeine and the constant low-level anxiety that had become her baseline state. "Crazy and stupid are different things," Elena had said, studying Maria's face with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading between the lines of teenage explanations and parental excuses. "Which one are you?" Maria had paused, coffee pot suspended in midair, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know," she'd answered finally. "Maybe both." Elena had laughed then, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Mija, if you were stupid, you wouldn't be asking that question. And if you weren't a little bit crazy, you'd still be cleaning other people's offices like your mother did, dreaming about possibilities instead of chasing them." That conversation had planted a seed that bloomed into an unexpected partnership. Elena had a modest retirement account and a lifetime of watching other people's dreams wither from lack of opportunity. She'd also grown up on stories about her own grandfather, a man who'd found water in impossible places during the drought years of the 1930s, using nothing more than intuition and an understanding of how the desert hoarded its secrets. "I'll loan you the money for the drilling," Elena had said the following week, her words falling into the diner's morning rush like stones into still water. "But I want to be there when they hit water. I want to see the look on your face when everyone realizes you weren't crazy after all." Maria had cried then, right there behind the coffee station, tears mixing with the steam from the industrial espresso machine, while the breakfast crowd buzzed around them, oblivious to the moment that was reshaping her entire future. For the first time since signing the deed, the possibility felt real instead of desperate, supported by something stronger than hope alone. The drilling was scheduled to begin the following Monday. Maria had taken 3 days off work, time she couldn't afford to lose but couldn't afford to miss, and arranged for Diego to stay with Carmen, who'd agreed to help despite her obvious disapproval of the entire venture. The night before the drilling began, Maria had driven out to the property one last time, standing in the darkness while the desert night settled around her like a blanket woven from starlight and possibility. The silence was different at night, less oppressive and more expectant, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Maria had walked the boundaries of her land, guided by moonlight and a cellular GPS that kept losing signal, marking the spot where her instincts insisted they should drill. Not the geometric center of the property, but a place where the terrain changed subtly, where the hard pan gave way to what looked like an ancient wash, where the creosote bushes grew slightly taller and the barrel cacti clustered in patterns that suggested underground moisture. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, Maria had felt the weight of every doubt, every criticism, every worried look from people who cared about her but couldn't understand what drove her to risk everything on an invisible possibility. But she'd also felt something else, the quiet certainty that had sustained her through years of double shifts and small defeats, the same instinct that had told her when Diego was running a fever, before he showed symptoms, when customers were going to leave good tips based on their body language, when her mother was sicker than she'd admitted in those final months. Sometimes you just knew things. Sometimes the knowing came from a place deeper than logic, older than fear, more reliable than the opinions of people who'd never risked anything more valuable than their dignity. As the eastern horizon began to lighten with the promise of dawn, Maria had pressed her hand once more against the desert floor, feeling that same subtle vibration that had convinced her to spend her last $500 on land that everyone else considered worthless. Tomorrow, they would know for certain whether she was a visionary or a fool. Tonight, standing alone in the vast silence of her impossible dream, Maria allowed herself to believe that sometimes the difference between the two was nothing more than the courage to dig deeper than anyone expected you to go. The desert wind picked up as dawn approached, carrying with it the scent of sage and possibilities, and Maria Vasquez smiled in the darkness, her calloused hand still pressed against the earth that would soon reveal its secrets, one way or another. The drilling rig arrived at dawn like a mechanical beast awakening from prehistoric slumber, its diesel engine coughing black smoke into the pristine desert air. Maria stood at the edge of her property, coffee growing cold in her trembling hands, watching as 3 men in oil-stained coveralls unloaded equipment that looked more suited to mining operations than the gentle water discovery she'd imagined. The lead driller, a weathered man named Jake Morrison, whose forearms bore tattoos of machinery and Bible verses in equal measure, approached her with the kind of measured stride that suggested he'd delivered bad news before. "Ma'am, this is the hardest ground I've drilled in 23 years, Jake warned. "If there's water here, it's gonna be expensive to find." Maria nodded, her throat too tight for words. She'd read the geological reports, studied the topographical maps, memorized every discouraging statistic the county records office had provided. On paper, her land was a hydrological wasteland, a place where even the most optimistic estimates suggested drilling to 800 feet before hitting anything that remotely resembled groundwater. At $12 per foot, that meant nearly $10,000 before they'd know whether her intuition was worth more than the paper her deed was printed on. "We'll go slow and steady," Jake continued, his voice gentler now, perhaps recognizing the fear behind her determined expression. "But ma'am, you need to understand, if we don't hit water by 600 feet, I'm going to recommend we stop. Past that depth, you're looking at commercial drilling costs. And frankly, this location doesn't justify that kind of investment." Elena Morales had arrived just as Jake finished his warning, her elderly Honda Civic leaving a dust plume that hung in the still morning air like a question mark. At 74, Elena moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for the battles that mattered. But her eyes held the bright intensity of a woman who'd spent her teaching career believing in long shots and lost causes. "Buenos dias, Jake," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing skeptical audiences. "I taught your nephew Danny back in '98. Bright boy, terrible at math, but he could write stories that would make you cry. How's he doing in Flagstaff?" Jake's weathered face broke into an unexpected smile. "Danny's doing good, Mrs. Morales. Got his degree in journalism, working for the paper up there. Still writes stories, too." He paused, studying Elena with new interest. "You're the one backing this drilling operation?" "I'm the one who believes in dreams that other people are too scared to chase," Elena replied, settling into a folding chair she'd brought from her car. "And I'm the one who's going to sit right here until we find out whether Maria's dream has water running through it." The first day of drilling felt like watching paint dry in slow motion. If paint required industrial machinery and cost $12 per brush stroke. The rig's diesel engine maintained a steady rumble that seemed to vibrate through the desert floor, while Jake and his crew fed steel pipe into the earth, inch by agonizing inch. Every 20 feet, they'd pause to examine the rock cuttings, Jake running the pulverized stone through his fingers with the concentration of a jeweler evaluating diamonds. Maria had taken the week off from the diner, a decision that would cost her nearly $400 in lost wages and tips, but she couldn't bear the thought of missing any moment that might determine her family's future. She'd set up a small camp beside Elena's chair, complete with a cooler of sandwiches, a thermos of coffee that she refilled compulsively, and a notebook where she recorded every detail of the operation with the methodical intensity of a scientist documenting a crucial experiment. 100 feet, Jake announced around noon, his voice barely audible over the rig's mechanical symphony. The cuttings at this depth were pale and dry, fragments of caliche that crumbled between his fingers like ancient bone. Still bone dry, but that's what we expected. The real test starts around 200. Maria nodded, making another notation in her book while trying to ignore the growing knot in her stomach. 100 feet meant $1,200 already invested. Money that Elena had advanced without hesitation, but that represented more cash than Maria had ever seen in one place. The weight of that debt, combined with the mounting evidence that her instincts might have led her astray, made each passing hour feel like a judgment being rendered in slow motion. Diego arrived after school, delivered by Carmen in a cloud of barely suppressed disapproval and exhaust fumes from her aging minivan. At 8 years old, Diego possessed the unconscious wisdom of children who'd learned to read adult emotions for signs of impending change, and his eyes went immediately to his mother's face, searching for clues about whether this desert adventure would end in celebration or catastrophe. "How deep are we going, Mama?" Diego asked, settling beside her on the folding blanket she'd spread across the hardpan. His question carried the weight of practical concerns that 8-year-olds shouldn't have to consider, and Maria felt the familiar ache of knowing that her son's childhood was being shaped by financial uncertainty and adult dreams that might prove to be delusions. "As deep as we need to go, mijon," Maria replied, pulling him closer while the drilling rig continued its relentless descent into the earth. "Sometimes the best things are buried so deep that most people stop looking before they find them." Carmen lingered beside the minivan, her arms crossed in the universal posture of older sisters who'd been proven right too many times to take satisfaction in it anymore. She'd agreed to watch Diego during the drilling operation, but her presence felt like a silent countdown to the moment when she'd have to pick up the pieces of Maria's shattered dreams and help put their lives back together again. "I brought dinner," Carmen said finally, her voice carefully neutral as she unloaded containers of homemade tamales and fresh salsa. Figured you'd be too nervous to eat, but you need to keep your strength up for whatever comes next. The second day dawned with a dust devil dancing across the drilling site, a spiraling column of desert air that seemed to mock their human efforts to penetrate the Earth's secrets. Jake and his crew arrived before sunrise, their movements more mechanical now, settling into the routine of industrial persistence that characterized most well-drilling operations. But Maria noticed something different in Jake's posture, a subtle tension that suggested professional concern beneath his carefully maintained optimism. 250 feet, Jake announced around mid-morning, holding up a handful of cuttings that looked identical to every previous sample. Still dry as a communion wafer, but the geology's starting to change. See how this limestone's got a different color? That could mean we're getting close to a formation that holds water. Elena leaned forward in her chair, studying the rock fragments with the intensity of someone whose retirement savings were literally disappearing into the ground 1 foot at a time. In my grandfather's time, she said quietly, the old-timers used to say that the desert keeps its water in layers, like a wedding cake. The top layers are just decoration, but if you can reach the foundation— Her voice trailed off as the drilling rig shuddered to a halt, its diesel engine dropping to an idle that seemed ominous in its sudden quiet. Jake disappeared into a huddle with his crew, their voices too low to hear, but their body language unmistakably tense. Maria felt her heart begin to race. Her notebook forgotten, she watched the men gesturing at the drilling equipment with a kind of urgent concern that suggested expensive problems. "Bid stuck," Jake announced finally, his words falling into the desert silence like stones into deep water. "We hit a hard formation around 240, and the drilling bit's jammed tighter than a tick on a hound. We're going to have to back out, change bits, and start this section over again." The delay cost them the rest of the day and another $800 in equipment rental fees. Maria watched the sun set over her property, while Jake's crew worked to extract the stuck drilling bit, their industrial lights creating an island of harsh illumination in the gathering darkness. Elena had gone home for dinner, promising to return the next morning, but Maria couldn't bring herself to leave the site, as if her physical presence might somehow influence the outcome of their subterranean gamble. Diego fell asleep, wrapped in a blanket beside her folding chair, his small body curled against the desert cold, while the drilling rig's engine provided a mechanical lullaby that seemed both comforting and ominous. Carmen had returned to town after extracting a promise that Maria would call if the drilling produced either water or bankruptcy, whichever came first. Alone with her sleeping son and the sound of machinery fighting stone, Maria allowed herself to confront the possibility that everyone else might be right about her desert folly. The third day brought weather that felt like an omen, though Maria couldn't decide whether it was good or bad. Storm clouds gathered on the eastern horizon, their dark promise of rain seeming to mock the drilling operation's search for underground water. Jake arrived looking grim, his usual morning optimism replaced with the kind of professional resignation that suggested he'd already begun preparing his customer for disappointment. 300 feet, Jake announced around noon, the words barely audible over a rumble of distant thunder. "We're into solid limestone now, and it's dry as the moon. The formation's getting harder, which means slower drilling and higher cost. Ma'am, I need to ask you a hard question. How deep are you prepared to go?" Elena looked at the handful of pulverized limestone Jake offered for her inspection, then at the storm clouds building overhead, then at Diego, who was building elaborate cities in the dirt with sticks and stones while maintaining the careful cheerfulness of children trying to keep adult anxieties at bay. The question Jake had asked wasn't really about drilling depth. It was about the moment when hope transforms into delusion, when persistence becomes self-destruction, when a mother's dreams start endangering her child's future. 12,000, Elena's investing, total. Have you ever found water this deep? Jake shook his head grimly.
Ma'am, in 23 years of drilling, I've pulled water out of places that defied every geological survey and professional prediction. I've also drilled dry holes in locations where every indicator suggested we'd hit artesian flow at 50 feet. The Earth keeps secrets that don't show up in government reports or university studies.
He paused, studying the storm clouds that were beginning to obscure the distant mountains, then turned back to Maria with an expression that balanced professional honesty with genuine compassion. But I've never drilled this deep in caliche and limestone without seeing some sign of moisture. Usually by 300 feet, you're seeing changes in the rock color, maybe some clay deposits, something that suggests water's been through the formation. What we're pulling up here looks like it hadn't seen moisture since the Pleistocene epoch. The words hit Maria like physical blows, each one confirming the fears that had been growing stronger with every foot of dry drilling. She'd gambled Elena's retirement savings and her family's financial security on an intuition that was beginning to feel less like divine inspiration and more like dangerous self-deception. The rational thing to do was stop now, cut their losses, and face the consequences of her decision with whatever dignity she could salvage from the wreckage of her dreams. But as Jake waited for her response, Maria found herself remembering her grandfather's stories about the old country, about farmers who could sense underground rivers and village wells that produced water in places where logic said none should exist. She thought about her mother, who'd spent 37 years cleaning other people's offices while dreaming of possibilities that remained forever just beyond her reach. She thought about Diego, who deserved a mother brave enough to chase impossible dreams instead of settling for probable failures. "Keep drilling," Maria said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "If we're gonna fail, let's fail completely. Let's go down so far that nobody can ever say we quit too soon." Jake nodded slowly, his weathered face showing a mixture of admiration and concern. "Yes, ma'am. But I want you to understand, past 400 feet, we're in territory where even finding water might not justify the cost. At these depths, you're looking at specialized pumping equipment, deeper casings, maintenance costs that could run thousands per year. Finding water isn't the same as finding a solution." "I understand," Maria replied, although she wasn't entirely sure she did. All she knew was that giving up now would mean facing Elena's gentle disappointment, Carmen's "I told you so" relief, and Diego's 8-year-old understanding that his mother was just another adult whose dreams were bigger than her capabilities. "Keep drilling," Maria said, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "If we're gonna fail, let's fail completely. Let's go down so far that nobody can ever say we quit too soon." The fourth day dawned clear and merciless, the storm clouds having passed without dropping their promised rain, leaving behind air that felt scrubbed clean and bright with possibility. Elena arrived early, bearing thermoses of coffee and a determination that seemed to have been reinforced overnight. She'd spent the previous evening on the phone with her cousin in New Mexico, a retired geologist who'd worked for mining companies throughout the Southwest. Roberto says limestone formations like this sometimes hide water in solution channels, caves, and underground rivers that don't show up in standard geological surveys. He says if there's water here, it'll be deep, but it could be substantial. Jake received this information with the polite skepticism of a professional who'd heard too many theories from well-meaning amateurs. But Maria noticed that he seemed to drill with renewed focus, paying closer attention to the rock cuttings and making more detailed notes about changes in the geological formations. At 350 feet, the limestone began showing traces of iron staining, subtle color changes that Jake examined with the intensity of a detective studying crucial evidence. "This is different," he said finally, holding up fragments that showed pale rust-colored streaks through the gray stone. "Iron staining usually means water's been through here at some point, probably recent enough to leave mineral deposits. We might be getting close to a formation that's seen moisture." Maria felt her heart begin to race,
hope and terror warring in her chest as the drilling rig resumed its relentless descent. 350 feet represented over $4,000 already invested, money that would take Elena to recover from her modest retirement income. But the iron standing in the limestone suggested that her grandfather's stories about hidden water might have more truth than anyone had dared to hope.
Diego had adapted to the drilling routine with the resilience of children who learn early that adult projects rarely follow predictable timelines. He'd claimed a section of desert near the rig as his personal domain, building elaborate sand cities and conducting complex negotiations with imaginary residents, while the real drama of his family's future unfolded in measurements of feet and dollars. But Maria noticed that he'd begun asking more specific questions about what would happen if they didn't find water, his 8-year-old mind beginning to process the possibility that this adventure might end in disappointment rather than vindication. "Mama?" he said during a brief pause in the drilling, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone testing dangerous waters. "If we don't find water, does that mean we're poor?" The question hit Maria like a physical blow, partly because of its devastating honesty, and partly because she wasn't sure how to answer it. They were already poor, by most definitions, living paycheck to paycheck in an apartment where the air conditioning worked sporadically and the refrigerator required a swift kick to maintain proper temperature. But Diego's question was really asking whether they were about to become a different kind of poor, the kind that resulted from dreams that destroyed the dreamers. "Mijo," Maria said carefully, kneeling beside his sand city to meet his eyes directly. "We're going to be okay, no matter what happens here. Finding water would make things better, but not finding it doesn't make us poor. It just makes us the same as we were before, except maybe a little wiser." Diego nodded with the solemn acceptance of children who've learned to take adult explanations at face value while quietly preparing for disappointment. But Maria saw in his eyes the same quality she'd recognized in mirrors throughout her own childhood, the premature understanding that dreams were luxuries that people like them couldn't always afford. As the drilling rig resumed its mechanical symphony, grinding slowly through limestone that had been undisturbed since the age of dinosaurs, Maria found herself praying to her grandfather's spirit, her mother's memory, and any desert gods that might be listening. 400 feet down, they were approaching the point where hope would either transform into vindication or collapse into the kind of lesson that children remember for the rest of their lives. The limestone continued yielding its secrets reluctantly, each foot of progress requiring more time, more fuel, more faith than the foot before it. But the iron staining was becoming more pronounced, and Jake's professional skepticism was gradually giving way to something that looked almost like optimism. 420 feet, he announced as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the desert floor. "The geology's definitely changing down here. We're seeing more mineral deposits, some clay layers, and the limestone's got a different texture. If there's water in this formation, we should know within the next 50 feet. Maria nodded, her notebook forgotten in her lap as she watched the drilling rig continue its methodical assault on the Earth's hidden chambers. 420 feet represented more money than she'd ever imagined spending on anything, yet somehow felt like the most reasonable investment she'd ever made. Somewhere beneath her feet, the desert was preparing to reveal whether her grandfather's wisdom about listening to the earth had been passed down intact or whether it had been diluted by time and wishful thinking into something resembling delusion. Either way, she would know soon enough. The desert, as always, would keep its secrets as long as someone was brave enough to keep asking questions. The call came at 5:30 in the morning, jerking Maria from the first real sleep she'd managed in 4 days. Jake's voice crackled through her ancient flip phone with the kind of controlled urgency that professionals use when delivering news that would make civilians panic. "Ma'am, "We need you out here right away. We've got a situation." Maria's heart hammered against her ribs as she threw on yesterday's clothes and shook Diego awake, her mind racing through every possible catastrophe that could have occurred during the night: equipment failure, cave-in, injury, bankruptcy. The drive to the drilling site felt endless, her Honda's aging engine straining against the pre-dawn darkness while Diego dozed fitfully in the passenger seat, his 8-year-old consciousness mercifully protected from the adult fears that clawed at her throat.
The scene that greeted them looked like the aftermath of an industrial accident. The drilling rig sat silent and askew, its massive frame tilted at an angle that suggested structural failure. Jake and his crew huddled around equipment that Maria's untrained eye couldn't identify, their faces grim in the harsh glare of portable work lights. But it was Elena's presence that truly alarmed her. The elderly woman sat in her folding chair like a general surveying a battlefield, her usual composure replaced by something that looked almost like shell shock. "What happened?" Maria asked, though part of her already knew that whatever Jake was about to tell her would transform this drilling operation from expensive gamble into complete disaster. "Sinkhole," Jake said simply, his weathered face showing the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting losing battles against geological forces. "Around 450 feet, we hit a void space in the limestone. Probably an old solution cave that's been hiding down there for millions of years. The drilling weight destabilized the formation, and about midnight, the whole thing collapsed." Maria stared at the tilted drilling rig, her mind struggling to process the implications of Jake's explanation. "Collapsed how?" "The rig stuck," Jake continued, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. "When the cave system collapsed, it created a sinkhole that's about 12 feet across and God knows how deep. The drilling platform's been pulled partially into the hole, and we can't extract it without specialized equipment that costs more than your land's worth." Elena spoke for the first time since Maria's arrival, her voice carrying a tremor that hadn't been there during 4 days of optimistic determination. "The insurance company says it's an act of God. Equipment stuck in sinkholes isn't covered under standard drilling policies." The numbers, when Jake finally explained them, were devastating beyond Maria's worst nightmares. Extracting the stuck drilling rig would require bringing in heavy machinery, possibly including a crane, at costs that would easily exceed $20,000. The drilling operation itself was finished. Even if they could recover the equipment, the sinkhole had destroyed any possibility of completing the well at this location. Elena's $12,000 investment was gone, along with any hope of finding water on Maria's 73 acres of desert wasteland. "There's more," Jake said, his reluctance obvious as he gestured toward the sinkhole. "County inspector's on his way out here. Anytime there's a drilling-related geological event, they have to assess whether the property's safe for human occupation. If they determine that the limestone formation's unstable, they could red tag the entire parcel." Maria felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The morning sun suddenly seeming too bright, the desert air too thin to breathe properly. Red tagging would mean her land was officially uninhabitable, worthless even as the cheapest form of rural real estate. She would lose Elena's money, her own investment, and the collateral for any future dreams of financial independence, all while facing potential liability for the stuck drilling equipment. Diego had wandered over to examine the sinkhole with the fearless curiosity of 8-year-olds who haven't yet learned that some holes in the earth represent catastrophe rather than adventure. "Mama, look how deep it goes," he called out, lying on his stomach at the edge of the cavity. "I can't even see the bottom." "Diego, get away from there!" Maria snapped, her voice sharper than she had intended, fear making her harsher than the situation warranted. But Diego's innocent excitement about the geological disaster that was destroying their future felt like salt in wounds that were already too deep to heal properly. The county inspector arrived at noon in a white pickup truck that looked like it had seen too many disaster sites. His clipboard and measuring equipment suggested a bureaucratic precision that would leave no room for hope or special circumstances. Robert Chen was a man in his 50s who'd spent 20 years evaluating the aftermath of human attempts to improve upon geological reality, and his expression suggested he'd seen this particular story play out too many times to find it surprising. "Ma'am, I need to ask you and your family to stay back while I assess the structural integrity of the limestone formation," Inspector Chen said, his voice carrying the neutral professionalism of someone delivering bad news as a full-time occupation. "Depending on what I find, we may need to evacuate this entire area until we can determine the extent of the underground instability." Elena had called her cousin Roberto, the retired geologist, who arrived that afternoon with equipment that looked more sophisticated than Jake's drilling operation. Roberto Morales carried himself with the confident authority of someone who'd spent 30 years reading the Earth's secrets for mining companies. But even his professional optimism seemed strained as he studied the sinkhole and its implications.
"This is a solution cave system," Roberto explained, setting up his ground-penetrating radar equipment while the county inspector took photographs and measurements. "The limestone here has been dissolving for thousands of years, creating underground chambers that don't show up in standard geological surveys. Your drilling operation just happened to punch through the roof of one of these caves at exactly the wrong angle." Maria watched Roberto's equipment paint electronic pictures of the underground terrain, revealing a hidden landscape of voids and chambers that extended far beyond the boundaries of her property. The geological survey that had cost her $200 had missed an entire subterranean world, a network of caves and passages that made her land not just worthless, but potentially dangerous. "The good news," Roberto continued, studying his radar displays with the concentration of someone interpreting a complex medical scan, "is that solution caves like this are often associated with underground water sources. The bad news is that accessing that water would require equipment and expertise that's way beyond the scope of a simple well drilling operation." Carmen arrived that evening with a casserole and an expression that managed to combine sympathy with the unmistakable satisfaction of someone whose warnings had been vindicated by disaster. She'd driven out after receiving Elena's phone call, bringing dinner and the kind of practical support that older sisters provide when younger sisters' dreams collapse into expensive reality. "Mija, it's time to cut your losses," Carmen said gently, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to recognize defeat before it became completely catastrophic. "Elena's insurance might cover some of the equipment costs, and maybe we can work out a payment plan for the rest. But this land's never going to be anything except a hole in the ground that costs money to maintain." Maria nodded absently, her attention focused on Diego, who was building elaborate cities in the dirt near the sinkhole while maintaining a cheerful commentary about underground civilizations and hidden treasures that might exist in the cave system below. His 8-year-old imagination had transformed their geological disaster into an adventure story, complete with brave explorers and mysterious discoveries waiting in the darkness beneath their feet. "What if Roberto's right about the water?" Maria asked, her voice barely audible over the evening wind that seemed to carry the desert's judgment on human presumption. "What if there really is an underground river system down there, but we just need different equipment to reach it?" Carmen's expression shifted from sympathy to alarm, the look of someone watching a loved one prepare to jump off a cliff after already falling into a canyon. "Maria, listen to yourself. You've already lost Elena's money, your land's probably going to be condemned, and you're talking about spending more money you don't have on equipment that costs more than houses. When is enough enough?" The question hung in the desert air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of stuck drilling equipment and geological instability. Carmen was really asking when Maria would stop being the kind of person who chased impossible dreams and start being the kind of person who accepted realistic limitations, when she would transform from a dreamer into someone who understood her place in the world's established order. Elena had remained unusually quiet during Carmen's intervention, but now she spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd spent the day reconsidering fundamental assumptions about risk and reward.
I've been thinking about what Roberto said about solution caves and underground water systems. My grandfather used to tell stories about Spanish explorers who found rivers running through limestone caves, whole underground valleys that stayed hidden until someone was brave enough to follow the darkness to its source. Elena, please don't encourage her, Carmen said, her voice carrying the desperation of someone watching multiple family members prepare to march over the same cliff. This has already cost you your retirement savings. How much more are you willing to lose? All of it, Elena replied simply, her words falling into the gathering darkness with the weight of decisions that change everything. I'm 74 years old, and I've spent my entire life being careful, being reasonable, making sensible choices that led to a sensible retirement in a sensible apartment where I watch sensible television shows until it's time for a sensible death. But Maria's dream isn't sensible, and maybe that's exactly why it's worth pursuing.
The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another vehicle, a dust-covered Jeep that materialized out of the desert darkness like something from Maria's grandfather's stories about apparitions and desert spirits. The driver was a woman in her 40s with sun-weathered skin and the kind of confident posture that suggested extensive familiarity with remote locations and complicated situations. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell," the woman announced, climbing out of her Jeep with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to working in harsh environments. "I'm a hydrogeologist with the University of Arizona, and I heard through professional channels that you folks might have stumbled onto something interesting out here." Roberto had called her, Maria learned, after his ground-penetrating radar revealed the full extent of the underground cave system. Dr. Mitchell specialized in karst hydrology, the study of water systems in limestone environments, and she'd driven 3 hours from Tucson to examine what her preliminary data suggested might be a significant geological discovery. "Solution cave systems like this are rare in Arizona," Dr. Mitchell explained, setting up her own equipment while the others watched with varying degrees of hope and skepticism. "Most of our underground water is in basin-fill aquifers or fractured rock systems, but limestone caves can contain substantial water reserves, especially if they're connected to regional groundwater flow patterns." Her equipment was more sophisticated than anything Roberto had brought, electronic devices that could map underground structures with precision that seemed almost supernatural. As Dr. Mitchell worked, painting increasingly detailed pictures of the subterranean landscape, Maria began to understand that their drilling disaster might have revealed something far more significant than a simple water well. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Mitchell said finally, studying her data displays with the excitement of someone who discovered something unexpected and potentially valuable. "You've got a cave system here that extends for miles underground, with multiple chambers and what looks like active water flow through several passages. This isn't just a well site, it's a significant hydrological feature that could supply water for thousands of acres." The revelation should have been encouraging, but Jake's expression suggested that Dr. Mitchell's discovery came with complications that outweighed its promise. "Doc, that's all real interesting from a scientific standpoint, but from a practical perspective, we're talking about accessing water through cave systems that might be hundreds of feet underground. The equipment costs alone would be astronomical, and that's assuming the caves are stable enough for human access." Dr. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully, her enthusiasm tempered by the practical considerations that Jake raised. "Accessing cave water systems does require specialized equipment and expertise. But if the water reserves are as extensive as my preliminary data suggests, we might be looking at a resource valuable enough to justify that investment." "How valuable?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the carefully neutral tone of someone who'd already lost one retirement fund and was considering risking whatever remained of her financial security.
Commercial water rights in Arizona are selling for premium prices, Dr. Mitchell replied, her words taking on the precision of someone delivering an economic assessment rather than a geological evaluation. If this cave system contains the kind of water reserves I think it does, we could be looking at millions of dollars in potential value, assuming someone could figure out how to extract it efficiently. The number hit the group like a physical force, transforming their disaster from expensive failure into something that might qualify as opportunity, if opportunity could be measured in risks that seem to expand exponentially with each new piece of information. Millions of dollars suggested possibilities that none of them had dared to consider, but it also suggested challenges that were beyond anything they had prepared themselves to face. Inspector Chen returned the following morning with a report that managed to be both encouraging and terrifying in equal measure. The sinkhole represented a localized geological event that didn't threaten the structural integrity of the surrounding area, but it had revealed underground features that required further investigation before the property could be certified as safe for development or habitation. Ma'am, I'm not red tagging your land, but I am requiring a comprehensive geological survey before any future drilling or construction activities. The cave system here is more extensive than our initial assessments indicated, and we need to understand its full scope before determining what kinds of activities are safe to pursue. The geological survey would cost $8,000 and take 6 weeks to complete, money that Elena didn't have for an investigation that might reveal her property was either incredibly valuable or completely worthless. Elena had already invested her retirement savings in the failed drilling operation, and the prospect of additional expenses seemed to test even her generous spirit and adventurous optimism. But Dr. Mitchell had spent the night reviewing her data and making phone calls to colleagues who specialized in cave hydrology, and she returned that morning with information that seemed to change everything about their situation. I've been talking to experts who've worked on similar cave systems in Texas and Florida, and several of them think this location could be a candidate for commercial water extraction using specialized cave diving and pumping techniques.
Cave diving? Carmen asked, her voice carrying the tone of someone who thought the situation couldn't get more dangerous or expensive, only to discover that she'd underestimated both the risks and the costs involved. Trained cave divers with specialized equipment can map underground water systems and install pumping apparatus in locations that conventional drilling can't reach, Dr. Mitchell explained. It's expensive and technically challenging, but if the water reserves are substantial enough, it could be economically viable. The conversation was attracting unexpected attention. Word about the sinkhole and the potential cave system had spread through the small community of geological professionals who worked in Arizona, and by afternoon, Maria's property had become an informal gathering point for hydrogeologists, cave specialists, and water rights attorneys who arrived unannounced to examine what was beginning to be described as a significant discovery. Among the visitors was Marcus Thompson, a water rights lawyer from Phoenix who specialized in representing clients with unusual or complicated claims to underground water resources. Thompson was a man in his 50s who dressed like a corporate attorney but spoke with the practical directness of someone who'd spent considerable time in courtrooms arguing about things that most people never thought about. Ma'am, if this cave system contains commercially viable water reserves, you need to understand that you're sitting on something that could attract serious attention from some serious people, Thompson said, his words carrying implications that seemed to expand the scope of their situation beyond anything Maria had prepared herself to handle. Water rights in Arizona are complicated under the best circumstances, and underground cave systems add layers of legal complexity that most property owners never have to consider. Thompson explained that water rights law in Arizona distinguished between surface water, groundwater, and what he called subterranean streams,
each category subject to different regulations and potential claims by various governmental and private entities. Cave systems that contained flowing water might qualify as subterranean streams, which could mean that Maria's ownership of the surface land didn't automatically grant her exclusive rights to the water beneath it. The good news is that you discovered this system through your own drilling operations on your own property, which gives you certain prior claim advantages under Arizona water law. The bad news is that if this water system extends beyond your property boundaries, which Dr. Mitchell's preliminary data suggests it does, other parties might have legitimate claims to portions of the resource. Maria felt as though she was drowning in information that seemed to grow more complex and threatening with each new revelation. What had begun as a simple attempt to drill a water well for domestic use had evolved into a legal and technical challenge that involved cave diving, commercial water extraction, competing claims from unknown parties, and financial risks that seemed to grow exponentially with each passing day. Diego had adapted to the chaos with the resilience of 8-year-olds who've learned that adult projects rarely follow predictable patterns. He'd established a base camp near the sinkhole where he conducted elaborate games involving underground explorers and hidden treasure, his imagination transforming their geological crisis into an adventure story that somehow felt more manageable than the actual situation they were facing. "Mama?" he asked, during a brief lull in the parade of experts and officials, "are we going to be rich or poor?" The question cut through all the technical complexities and legal complications to the heart of what really mattered: whether Maria's gamble with Elena's money and her family's future would ultimately provide Diego with more opportunities or fewer, whether her willingness to chase impossible dreams would give him reasons to be proud of her mother or reasons to be embarrassed by her poor judgment. "I don't know, mijo," Maria replied honestly, pulling him close while Dr. Mitchell and Marcus Thompson discussed the finer points of subterranean stream law. "But I think we're going to find out together, and whatever happens, we're going to be okay." That evening, after the experts had departed and the machinery had fallen silent, Maria sat alone beside the sinkhole while Diego slept in the car and Elena dozed in her folding chair. The desert night settled around them with its familiar weight of silence and starlight, but the landscape felt different now, charged with possibilities that ranged from extraordinary wealth to complete catastrophe.
Somewhere beneath her feet, water flowed through chambers that had been carved by time and chemistry into spaces that might hold the key to her family's future. The drilling disaster that had seemed like the end of her dreams might actually be the beginning of something far more complex and valuable than she'd ever imagined. But accessing that value would require courage, resources, and expertise that pushed the boundaries of everything she thought she understood about risk and reward. The sinkhole gaped like an open mouth in the desert floor, revealing darkness that seemed both threatening and full of promise. Tomorrow would bring more experts, more complications, more decisions that would determine whether Maria Vasquez was a visionary who'd discovered something extraordinary or a dreamer who'd stumbled into a nightmare that was beyond her ability to escape. Either way, there was no turning back now. The Earth had revealed its secrets, and those secrets were too valuable and too dangerous to ignore. The divers arrived at dawn 3 weeks later, their specialized equipment transforming Maria's property into something resembling a NASA launch site. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent those intervening weeks assembling a team of professionals who treated underground exploration with the same precision that surgeons applied to heart operations, and watching them prepare for their descent into the sinkhole felt like witnessing the final moments before a space mission. Tom Rodriguez was the lead diver, a man in his 40s whose weathered face and calm demeanor suggested extensive familiarity with environments where mistakes could be fatal. He'd spent 15 years mapping cave systems throughout Mexico and the American Southwest, developing techniques for accessing underground water sources that conventional drilling couldn't reach.
His partner, Jessica Wu, was a hydrogeologist who'd specialized in submerged cave environments, combining technical diving expertise with the scientific knowledge needed to evaluate underground water resources. "Ma'am, I want you to understand what we're dealing with here," Tom said, as his team assembled diving equipment that looked more complex than anything Maria had ever seen. Based on Dr. Mitchell's surface surveys, this cave system extends for miles underground, with multiple chambers at different depths. If there's water down there, and our preliminary data suggests there is, we're looking at one of the most significant hydrological discoveries in Arizona's recent history. Maria nodded, her notebook forgotten in her lap, as she watched the divers conduct equipment checks with methodical precision. 3 weeks of waiting had transformed her initial panic about the drilling disaster into something approaching cautious optimism, though the stakes involved still made her stomach clench whenever she allowed herself to consider all the ways this exploration could go wrong. Elena had spent those weeks consulting with financial advisors, water rights attorneys, and investment specialists who helped her understand that their situation had evolved far beyond the scope of a simple well drilling operation. If the cave system contained commercially viable water reserves, they would need to form a limited liability company, obtain specialized permits, and navigate regulatory requirements that could take years to complete. "I've been thinking about what your grandfather used to say about listening to the earth," Elena had told Maria the previous evening, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone of someone who'd spent considerable time reconsidering fundamental assumptions about risk and intuition. Maybe he wasn't talking about hearing water underground. Maybe he was talking about recognizing opportunities that other people are too afraid or too conventional to pursue. Diego had become the unofficial mascot of the diving operation, his 8-year-old enthusiasm about underground exploration proving infectious, even among professionals who approached cave systems with appropriate caution and respect. He'd appointed himself the keeper of surface communications, responsible for monitoring radio transmissions between the divers and their support team. A role that made him feel important while keeping him safely away from the actual sinkhole. "Mama, Tom says they're going to find an underground river with fish that have never seen sunlight," Diego announced excitedly, his imagination having transformed the technical aspects of cave exploration into an adventure story worthy of National Geographic documentaries. And maybe treasure that Spanish explorers left behind hundreds of years ago. The first dive began at precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, Tom and Jessica disappearing into the sinkhole with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested they understood exactly how many things could go wrong in environments where rescue operations would be nearly impossible. Maria watched their lights fade into the darkness below, her hands clenched so tightly that her fingernails left marks in her palms. Carmen had driven out for the dive operation, bringing thermoses of coffee and the kind of nervous energy that older sisters display when younger sisters are involved in activities that could result in either tremendous success or spectacular failure. She'd spent the previous week researching cave diving accidents, a decision that had provided her with detailed knowledge about all the ways that underground exploration could end in tragedy.
"I still think you're all completely insane," Carmen announced, settling beside Maria with the resigned air of someone who'd accepted that family loyalty sometimes required witnessing dangerous stupidity. "But if you're going to be insane, at least you're doing it with professionals instead of trying to explore that cave system with garden hoses and flashlights." The radio crackled to life 20 minutes after the divers had disappeared. Tom's voice emerging from the static with the calm professionalism of someone reporting routine observations rather than potentially life-changing discoveries. "Surface, this is Tom. We're at about 40 feet depth, and the cave system's opening up into a much larger chamber than our surface surveys indicated. The limestone formations are spectacular, and we're seeing clear evidence of active water flow."
You guys, I can't even believe what happens next in Maria's story. We're talking about a discovery that will literally change her family's life forever. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear about never giving up on impossible dreams. Dr. Mitchell monitored the radio communications while simultaneously tracking the divers' progress on electronic displays that painted real-time pictures of the underground terrain they were exploring. Her equipment showed the cave system extending far beyond what anyone had anticipated, a network of chambers and passages that seemed to connect underground features across a geographic area measured in square miles rather than acres. "This is incredible," Dr. Mitchell murmured, studying data that was being transmitted from the divers' equipment in real time. "The cave system is much more extensive than our preliminary surveys suggested, and the water flow indicators are showing substantial volume moving through multiple channels." Jessica's voice joined the radio transmission 30 minutes into the dive, her tone carrying the excitement of someone who'd discovered something unexpected and potentially extraordinary. "Sarah, you need to see these mineral formations. We're looking at travertine deposits that suggest this water system's been active for thousands of years, and the flow rates are much higher than we anticipated." Maria felt her heart begin to race as the radio transmissions painted increasingly detailed pictures of the underground landscape that existed beneath her property. The divers were describing chambers large enough to hold buildings, water flows that could supply small cities, and geological formations that suggested her 73 acres sat above a hydrological system that extended throughout the region. But it was Tom's next transmission that transformed speculation into something approaching certainty. "Surface, we've hit it," Tom's voice crackled through the radio. "We're looking at the largest underground water system ever discovered in Arizona. Maria, you just found treasure worth hundreds of millions of dollars." The single mother who'd been called crazy had just proven that sometimes impossible dreams contain the most precious truths. The words hit Maria like physical blows, each technical detail confirming that her grandfather's stories about hidden water and her own intuitive certainty about underground resources had been vindicated in ways that exceeded her most optimistic fantasies. Somewhere beneath her feet, nature had been conducting a patient experiment in hydraulic engineering, creating a water storage and distribution system that made human infrastructure look primitive by comparison. Elena had been unusually quiet during the dive operation, but now she spoke with the voice of someone who just watched impossible dreams transform into tangible reality. "Maria, do you understand what this means? You didn't just find water. You found what might be one of the most significant water resources in the entire Southwest." The implications were staggering and terrifying in equal measure. Commercial water extraction from the cave system could generate revenues measured in millions of dollars annually. But accessing that revenue would require investment in specialized equipment, navigating complex regulatory requirements, and managing environmental concerns that could attract attention from governmental agencies, environmental groups, and corporate interests who might view Maria's discovery as either an opportunity or a threat. Marcus Thompson, the water rights attorney, had remained on site throughout the dive operation, taking detailed notes about the discoveries that were being transmitted from 40 feet underground. His presence reminded everyone that legal complications would begin the moment the divers surfaced with confirmation of commercially viable water reserves.
Ma'am, based on what we're hearing from the divers, you need to understand that this discovery is going to attract attention from parties you probably haven't considered, Thompson said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who delivered complex legal advice for a living. State water management agencies, federal environmental regulators, Native American tribal councils with historical claims to regional water resources, agricultural interests, municipal water districts. Everyone who has a stake in Arizona water rights is going to want to understand exactly what you found down there. The radio crackled with Jessica's voice, transmitting information that seemed to grow more extraordinary with each new observation.
Sarah, we're seeing evidence of multiple aquifer connections at different levels. This isn't just an isolated cave system. It appears to be a major node in a regional groundwater network that could extend from the Catalina Mountains to the Santa Rita Range. Dr. Mitchell's equipment was painting increasingly detailed pictures of underground geography that challenged everything the experts thought they understood about regional hydrology. The cave system beneath Maria's property appeared to be connected to groundwater sources throughout southern Arizona, making it potentially valuable not just as a local water source, but as a critical component of the region's entire hydrological infrastructure. This changes everything we know about water distribution in this part of Arizona, Dr. Mitchell said, studying displays that showed underground connections extending far beyond the boundaries of any single property. If these connections are as extensive as the preliminary data suggests, we're looking at a discovery that could reshape how the entire region manages its water resources. Tom's next transmission carried news that transformed their situation from extraordinary to almost incomprehensible. Surface, we found something you're not going to believe. This main chamber contains what appears to be a natural sump that's been collecting mineral deposits for thousands of years. We're looking at formations that include significant concentrations of rare earth elements. The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that extended far beyond water rights into territory that none of them had prepared themselves to consider. Rare earth elements were minerals used in everything from cell phones to electric vehicle batteries, materials so strategically important that their discovery could attract attention from federal agencies and international corporations. "What kind of rare earth elements?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone who realized they might be witnessing multiple discoveries simultaneously. Jessica's response came through clearly, each word carrying weight that seemed to bend the desert air around them. Preliminary field tests are showing significant concentrations of lithium, neodymium, and what appears to be substantial deposits of scandium. Sarah, if these concentrations are consistent throughout the formation, we could be looking at one of the most significant rare earth deposits ever discovered in North America. Maria felt the world tilt beneath her feet, her understanding of their situation expanding beyond anything she'd imagined possible. They'd begun by searching for enough water to supply a single household and had discovered what might be both a major hydrological resource and a mineral deposit valuable enough to attract international attention. Diego had been listening to the radio transmissions with the fascination of someone following an adventure story, but now he looked up at his mother with 8-year-old directness that cut through all the technical complexities to the heart of what really mattered. "Mama, does this mean we're rich now?" The question everyone had been avoiding hung in the desert air, while the divers continued their exploration 40 feet underground, their discoveries reshaping not just Maria's understanding of her property's value, but the entire scope of possibilities that her $500 gamble had revealed.
Elena answered before Maria could find her voice, her words carrying the weight of someone who just watched a lifetime of careful financial planning become suddenly irrelevant. "Mijo, if what these divers are finding is real, your mama didn't just buy desert land. She bought what might be one of the most valuable pieces of property in the entire state of Arizona." The radio transmitted Tom's voice with news that seemed to expand their discovery into a realm of the surreal. "Surface, we've reached a secondary chamber that appears to contain even higher concentrations of rare earth minerals. The formations here are unlike anything in the geological literature. We're looking at what might be a unique depositional environment that's been concentrating these elements for millions of years." Marcus Thompson had been taking notes throughout the dive operation, but now he looked up from his legal pad with an expression that combined professional excitement with deep concern. "Ma'am, you need to understand that rare earth mineral discoveries trigger federal oversight requirements that are completely different from state water rights regulations. We're potentially looking at national strategic material designations, Department of Defense involvement, and international trade implications that go far beyond anything we've discussed." The complexity of their situation was expanding exponentially with each new piece of information transmitted from the cave system below.
What had begun as a family's desperate gamble on finding domestic water had evolved into a discovery that could attract attention from federal agencies, international corporations, and foreign governments interested in securing access to materials that were essential to modern technology. Dr. Mitchell's equipment was recording everything, creating a permanent record of discoveries that would need to be reported to various governmental and scientific agencies within specific timeframes established by federal regulations. The moment the divers surfaced with their findings, Maria's quiet desert property would become the focus of attention from parties she'd never considered and obligations she'd never imagined. But it was Jessica's final transmission that truly captured the magnitude of what they discovered. "Sarah, we've completed our preliminary survey, and I need to tell you that this cave system represents what might be the most significant combined water and mineral resource discovery in the modern history of the American Southwest. We're looking at resources that could be valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars, assuming appropriate extraction techniques and regulatory approvals." Hundreds of millions of dollars. The number seemed too large to have any connection to Maria's life, to Diego's future, to the modest dreams that had led her to spend her last $500 on land that everyone had considered worthless. She was still a single mother who worked double shifts at a diner, still lived in an apartment where the air conditioning worked sporadically, still drove a Honda with 200,000 miles and a transmission that required prayer to function properly. But somewhere beneath her feet, nature had been conducting experiments in chemistry and geology that had created resources valuable enough to change not just her family's future, but potentially the economic landscape of the entire region. The water system could supply municipalities throughout southern Arizona, while the rare earth mineral deposits could provide materials essential to American technological and defense industries. The divers surfaced 45 minutes later, their faces showing the kind of controlled excitement that professionals display when they've discovered something that exceeds every reasonable expectation. Tom and Jessica emerged from the sinkhole like explorers returning from an alien world, carrying water samples, mineral specimens, and documentation of discoveries that would need to be verified by independent laboratories before anyone could begin to understand their full implications. "Ma'am, in 15 years of cave exploration, I've never seen anything remotely comparable to what exists beneath your property. You're sitting on top of what might be one of the most significant natural resource discoveries of the 21st century." Maria nodded, her voice lost somewhere between disbelief and a gratitude so profound that it felt like a physical weight in her chest. Around her, the desert that had seemed like a monument to her poor judgment was revealing itself to be something altogether different, a landscape that had been keeping extraordinary secrets, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to dig deep enough to discover them.
The sun was setting over her 73 acres of transformed desert, painting the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than any sunset she could remember. Tomorrow would bring laboratories and lawyers, federal inspectors and corporate representatives, environmental assessments and international attention that would change everything about their quiet lives. But tonight, standing beside the sinkhole that had revealed treasures beyond her grandfather's wildest stories, Maria Vasquez allowed herself to believe that sometimes listening to the Earth's whispered secrets could lead to discoveries that transformed impossible dreams into miraculous reality. Diego stood beside her, his small hand in hers, looking down into the cave system that might hold their future. "Mama," he said quietly, "I think Grandpa would be proud of you." Maria smiled, tears blurring her vision as she squeezed her son's hand and whispered a prayer of gratitude to her grandfather's spirit, her mother's memory, and the desert gods who had finally decided to reveal their most precious secrets to a woman brave enough to risk everything on an impossible dream. 6 months after the cave divers surfaced with samples that would change everything, Maria Vasquez stood in a conference room 30 floors above downtown Phoenix, looking out at a cityscape that seemed impossibly small from this altitude. The Arizona Republic's headline that morning, it read, "Desert Discovery. Single mother's $500 gamble yields $140 million mineral find." But the number felt abstract, disconnected from the woman who still checked her bank balance twice before buying groceries and drove the same Honda with 200,000 miles that had carried her to her impossible dream. The conference table was crowded with federal specialists, mining executives, and Senator Patricia Dawson, who'd flown in from Washington to discuss Maria's discovery. Carrying the authority of someone accustomed to congressional hearings and cabinet briefings, Carmen had been among the most shocked observers of her sister's vindication, her skepticism gradually transforming into amazement as independent laboratory reports confirmed that Maria's intuition about underground treasure had been not just correct, but dramatically understated. The sister who worried about Maria's judgment had become one of her most trusted advisors, helping manage the practical aspects of sudden wealth while keeping family relationships grounded in affection rather than financial obligation. The tribal water rights situation requires careful consideration, said Joseph Yazzie, representing the Tohono O'odham Nation, whose ancestral territories included portions of the underground aquifer system. Our people have traditional claims to water sources throughout this region that predate modern property law, and any commercial extraction needs to acknowledge those historical rights while ensuring that tribal communities benefit from resources that have sustained our culture for generations. Maria had insisted that tribal representatives be included in all discussions about water extraction, partly because legal precedent required their involvement, but mostly because her grandfather's stories about respecting the earth included respecting the people who'd learned its secrets first. The negotiations had been complex but respectful, resulting in agreements that granted tribal communities both financial participation in the water extraction profits and guaranteed access to traditional water sources. The mining rights had attracted international attention that still felt surreal to Maria. Executives from companies based in Australia, Canada, and Germany had flown to Phoenix for meetings about extraction partnerships, their presentations filled with technical details about mining techniques that could access rare earth deposits without damaging the cave's system's hydrological functions. The technology required was sophisticated enough to make Maria grateful for advisors who understood both the engineering challenges and the market dynamics involved. You're looking at $8 million annually from water, plus $15 to $20 million from minerals, Robert Chen explained. The numbers still felt abstract, though Maria had learned to recognize their practical implications. $8 million annually meant Diego could attend any university in the world without financial consideration. $20 million meant she could endow scholarships for other single mothers whose dreams exceeded their bank accounts. It meant Elena's retirement would be comfortable rather than carefully budgeted, and Carmen's children could pursue opportunities that wouldn't be constrained by economic limitations. But the most meaningful transformation had been the recognition that her grandfather's wisdom about listening to the earth had been vindicated in ways that exceeded his most elaborate stories. The intuition that had led her to spend her last $500 on worthless desert land had been validated by discoveries that established her as someone whose instincts about hidden resources could be trusted rather than pitied. There's one more aspect of this discovery that we need to discuss, said Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd become the lead scientific coordinator for the ongoing studies. The cave system's unique depositional environment appears to be still active, meaning it continues to concentrate rare earth elements from groundwater flows. This isn't just a finite mineral deposit, it's essentially a natural processing facility that could continue producing valuable materials for generations. The revelation that her property contained not just extraordinary mineral deposits, but a geological system that continued creating those deposits transformed her discovery from a one-time windfall into something approaching a geological annuity. The cave system had been conducting chemistry experiments for millions of years, and those experiments would continue long after current extraction technologies became obsolete. Elena had insisted on establishing educational partnerships that would ensure the discovery contributed to scientific understanding as well as economic benefit. The University of Arizona had established a research station on the property, where graduate students in geology, hydrology, and material science could study the cave system's unique characteristics while developing extraction techniques that minimized environmental impact.
Mrs. Vasquez, I think it's important to acknowledge what your discovery means beyond its immediate economic value, said Dr. William Patterson, director of the United States Geological Survey. This find is changing how we understand rare earth geology throughout the American Southwest. The depositional processes you've revealed could help us locate similar resources in other locations, potentially transforming American mineral independence. The scientific implications had been as unexpected as the economic ones. Researchers studying Maria's cave system had developed new theories about how underground water systems could concentrate rare earth elements, leading to exploration programs in Nevada, Utah, and New Mexico that were already showing promising results. Her grandfather's wisdom about the earth keeping secrets had proven prophetic in ways that extended far beyond her 73 acres of transformed desert. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of her vindication had been the response from people who'd initially dismissed her dreams as dangerous delusion. Mrs. Rodriguez, the upstairs neighbor who'd suggested that desert land was worthless unless you planned to die on it, had become one of Maria's most enthusiastic supporters, proudly telling anyone who'd listen about her friendship with the woman who found treasure in the desert. The real estate agent who'd barely suppressed his laughter while selling her the property had called repeatedly, offering his services for managing what he now described as one of the most valuable parcels in Arizona. His transformation from condescending salesman to eager supplicant had provided Elena with endless entertainment, though Maria had chosen to work with advisors who demonstrated respect for her judgment before it proved profitable. "I want to make sure we address the broader implications of Mrs. Vasquez's success," said Senator Dawson, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering remarks for public consumption. "This discovery demonstrates that American entrepreneurial spirit and willingness to take calculated risks can yield results that benefit not just individual families, but national economic security. Mrs. Vasquez's courage in pursuing her vision despite skepticism from experts and family members exemplifies the kind of innovation that keeps America competitive in global markets." Maria smiled politely at the senator's characterization of her decision as calculated risk, though she suspected that spending grocery money on desert land based on her grandfather's stories about underground treasure hadn't qualified as calculation by any conventional definition. But she'd learned that success transformed risky decisions into visionary investments, at least in the eyes of people who needed her story to support their own narratives about American enterprise. Diego had asked to address the gathering, his 9-year-old desire to participate in adult ceremonies overcoming his usual preference for sandbox architecture over formal meetings. Maria had agreed, partly because his perspective on their transformation had proven remarkably insightful, and partly because she wanted him to understand that their success carried obligations to use their good fortune wisely. "I want to make thank you to everyone who helped my mama find the treasure under our desert," Diego said, his young voice carrying clearly through the conference room's sophisticated audio system. "My mama always said that sometimes you have to dig deeper than other people think you should, and now I know she was right. But I also want to say that the most important treasure wasn't the money or the minerals. It was finding out that my mama was brave enough to chase impossible dreams." The conference room fell silent, Diego's words providing a perspective on their discovery that cut through all the technical complexities and financial implications to something more fundamental about courage, family, and the willingness to risk everything for possibilities that existed only in imagination until someone made them real. Elena wiped tears from her eyes, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed the gathered officials and experts. "I've spent my entire career teaching children that success comes from hard work and careful planning, and those lessons remain true. But Maria's story taught me that sometimes the most important ingredient for success is the courage to believe in possibilities that other people can't see, even when those possibilities seem impossible."
As the formal meeting concluded and participants began departing for airports and offices, Maria found herself alone with Diego and Elena in the conference room, looking out at the Phoenix skyline that seemed to shimmer with possibilities that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. The city below contained millions of people pursuing their own dreams, most of them constrained by economic realities and practical limitations that Maria had somehow managed to transcend through a combination of intuition, courage, and geological luck. "Mama," Diego said, pressing his face against the window to study the urban landscape far below, "what are we going to do with all this money?" Maria considered the question, her mind ranging across possibilities that would have been unthinkable during her years of double shifts and apartment living. She could travel anywhere, buy anything. Ensure that Diego never experienced the kind of financial anxiety that had shaped her own childhood. But the question that really mattered wasn't what she could do with her wealth, but what she should do to honor the courage and sacrifice of people who'd supported her impossible dream. "We're going to help other people chase their impossible dreams," Maria replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd discovered that the most meaningful treasure wasn't money, but the freedom to transform other people's possibilities. "We're going to make sure that other families don't have to choose between paying rent and pursuing opportunities, that other mothers don't have to work double shifts while dreaming about better futures for their children." Elena nodded approvingly, her teacher's instincts recognizing wisdom that transcended financial planning or investment strategy. "Your grandfather would be proud, mija. Not just because you found treasure, but because you understand that the real treasure is what you do with the opportunities that treasure provides." As they left the conference room and returned to the desert property that had transformed their lives, Maria reflected on the journey that had led from $500 and a desperate gamble to recognition as someone whose instincts about hidden resources deserved respect rather than ridicule. The physical landscape of her land looked essentially unchanged. The same saguaro cacti, the same creosote bushes, the same vast silence that either mocked or encouraged her dreams, depending on her state of mind. But everything else had been transformed. Where neighbors had once seen a poor single mother making questionable financial decisions, they now saw someone whose vision had exceeded every reasonable expectation. Where experts had seen worthless desert land, they now saw one of the most significant natural resource discoveries in modern American history. Where Maria had once seen only possibility sustained by hope, she now saw proof that sometimes listening to voices that others couldn't hear could lead to treasures that exceeded the boundaries of imagination. The sinkhole that had nearly destroyed their dreams had been transformed into the entrance to a research facility where scientists from around the world came to study the geological processes that had created their underground treasure. Diego had claimed a section of the property as his personal domain, where he continued building elaborate cities while discussing plans for the scholarship foundation that would bear his grandmother's name. As the sun set over their transformed desert, painting the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than any sunset Maria could remember, she allowed herself to feel the profound satisfaction of someone who'd risked everything on an impossible dream and discovered that impossible dreams sometimes contain the most precious forms of truth. Her grandfather's wisdom about the earth-keeping secrets had been vindicated in ways that honored both his memory and the courage required to trust inherited wisdom over conventional expertise. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibilities, and Maria Vasquez smiled in the gathering darkness, her weathered hands pressed against earth that had finally revealed its most precious secrets to a woman brave enough to dig deeper than anyone expected her to go. 5 years later, Maria stood before world leaders at the United Nations. The woman who'd once counted diner tips to afford groceries now ran a foundation that helped other dreamers chase impossible possibilities. Her $500 gamble had become a $140 million empire. But more importantly, it proved that ordinary people who trust their extraordinary instincts can change the world. The woman who'd once counted diner tips to afford $500 of desert land now spoke to audiences about sustainable development models that honored both economic opportunity and environmental stewardship.
"The earth keeps secrets," Maria began, her voice carrying clearly through simultaneous translation systems that delivered her words in dozens of languages to delegates from around the world. "My grandfather taught me that lesson when I was young, but I spent years learning what it really meant. Sometimes those secrets are geological, water systems and mineral deposits that exist in places where conventional wisdom says they shouldn't. But sometimes those secrets are about human potential, about possibilities that remain hidden until someone is brave enough to look deeper than anyone expects them to go." The audience listened with the respectful attention reserved for speakers whose personal stories had intersected with broader themes of global significance. Maria's discovery had become a case study in multiple fields: geological science, resource extraction technology, community development, and the economics of sustainable mining. But her presence at the UN conference reflected recognition that her story offered insights that transcended technical considerations to address fundamental questions about courage, intuition, and the willingness to pursue possibilities that seemed impossible. Diego, now 14 years old and attending boarding school in Switzerland, where he studied in 4 languages while maintaining correspondence with scientists studying the cave systems on their property, sat in the audience with the quiet pride of teenagers who'd learned that their parents were considered remarkable by people whose opinions mattered on a global scale. His acceptance letter to the International School of Geneva included a note from the admissions committee acknowledging that his unique perspective on resource development and environmental stewardship made him an ideal candidate for their programs in sustainable development. Elena, at 79, had become an unexpected authority on geriatric entrepreneurship and late-life risk-taking, her partnership with Maria serving as evidence that wisdom accumulated over decades could provide the foundation for ventures that younger people might consider too audacious to attempt. The Elena Morales Foundation for Educational Innovation had established programs in 37 countries, providing microloans and technical assistance to individuals whose dreams exceeded their financial resources. The Vasquez discovery, as it had come to be known in geological literature, had generated revenues that exceeded initial projections while maintaining environmental standards that satisfied the most stringent regulatory requirements. The rare earth extraction operations employed advanced techniques that minimized surface disturbance while maximizing resource recovery, creating a model for sustainable mining that was being studied and replicated in locations throughout the world. But the water extraction had proven even more significant than the mineral deposits. The underground aquifer system continued providing 50 million gallons annually to municipal water districts throughout southern Arizona, while advanced filtration and recycling systems ensured that the cave ecosystem remained undisturbed. The technology developed for accessing cave-based water sources had been adapted for use in drought-stricken regions of Africa, Australia, and the Middle East, where similar geological formations offered hope for communities facing chronic water scarcity. Carmen had transformed from skeptical older sister to chief operating officer of Vasquez Sustainable Resources, the company Maria had established to manage their expanding operations. Her background in practical problem-solving and her instinctive understanding of family dynamics had proven invaluable in managing business relationships that required balancing profit motives with environmental concerns and community obligations. The company employed over 300 people, most of them from local communities that had benefited from the economic development generated by Maria's discovery. "I want to share something that happened last week," Maria continued, her voice carrying the conversational intimacy that made international audiences feel like they were listening to stories told among friends rather than formal presentations delivered to global conferences. "A woman named Sarah Johnson contacted our foundation from rural Montana. She's a single mother working 2 jobs, and she believes there's geothermal energy beneath her family's ranch, energy that could provide clean electricity for her entire community. Conventional geological surveys say she's wrong, but she's asking for our help because she trusts her instincts more than expert opinions."
The audience murmured with recognition, understanding that Maria's story was about to come full circle, connecting her own experience with someone else's impossible dream. The Vasquez Foundation had received thousands of similar requests from people around the world who'd heard about the woman who'd found treasure in the desert and wondered whether their own intuitions about hidden resources might deserve investigation rather than dismissal. 5 years ago, I would have been that woman writing letters to strangers, hoping someone would believe in possibilities that seemed impossible to everyone else, Maria said, her voice carrying the weight of memory and the lightness of gratitude. Today, our foundation has the resources to help Sarah Johnson drill exploratory geothermal wells, and if her instincts prove correct, her community could become energy independent within 2 years. The foundation had funded similar projects on 6 continents, solar installations in rural Kenya based on local weather pattern observations that meteorologists had overlooked, wind energy systems in coastal Peru designed by fishermen who understood regional air currents better than engineering consultants, and water extraction projects in drought-stricken regions of India, where traditional knowledge about underground springs was being validated by modern hydrogeological techniques. Each success story reinforced Maria's conviction that expert knowledge, while valuable, wasn't always comprehensive enough to recognize opportunities that required different ways of understanding natural systems. Her grandfather's wisdom about listening to the earth had proven applicable far beyond their Arizona desert, offering insights that resonated with traditional knowledge holders in cultures around the world who'd maintained connections to natural systems that academic institutions had often dismissed as unscientific. But I also want to acknowledge that pursuing impossible dreams carries real risks, Maria continued, her honesty about the emotional and financial costs of her journey providing balance to success stories that might otherwise seem too perfect to be instructive. There were nights when I lay awake wondering whether I was risking my son's future on delusions, whether I was the visionary I hoped to be or simply another poor person making poor decisions. Those doubts were real, and they were justified by evidence that any reasonable person would have found convincing. The acknowledgement of doubt and uncertainty made her story more rather than less inspiring, offering recognition that courage required confronting fear rather than its absence. The Foundation's application process included psychological counseling and financial planning assistance, ensuring that people who received support for pursuing unconventional resource development understood both the potential rewards and the probable costs of their chosen paths. Diego had written extensively about the psychological impact of sudden wealth on families unprepared for the social and emotional changes that accompanied dramatic financial transformation. His essays about adapting to international schools while maintaining connections to desert landscapes had been published in journals focused on adolescent development and cultural adaptation, offering insights that child psychologists found valuable for understanding how young people process extraordinary changes in family circumstances. My son Diego likes to say that the most important treasure we found wasn't mineral deposits or water rights, but the discovery that ordinary people can trust their instincts about extraordinary possibilities, Maria said, gesturing toward Diego with the unmistakable pride of mothers whose children have exceeded every reasonable expectation. He's probably right, though I confess that the financial security doesn't hurt either. The audience laughed appreciatively, recognizing the human honesty that made Maria's presentations more engaging than typical conference addresses. Her willingness to acknowledge that money mattered, that financial security created opportunities for generosity that poverty couldn't sustain, provided a realistic foundation for discussions about sustainable development that might otherwise become overly idealistic. The scientific research station established on their property had become a pilgrimage site for geologists, hydrologists, and mining engineers interested in understanding the depositional processes that had created their underground treasure. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had published 17 peer-reviewed papers based on studies of the cave system, each one contributing to scientific understanding of how rare earth elements could be concentrated by natural processes over geological timescales. But the research had also attracted attention from less conventional sources. Indigenous knowledge holders from around the world had visited their property to study traditional techniques for identifying underground resources,
leading to collaborative research projects that combined ancestral wisdom with modern scientific methods. The resulting publications had begun bridging gaps between academic geology and traditional ecological knowledge that had persisted for generations.
I want to close by sharing something my grandfather told me when I was very young, Maria said, her voice taking on the intimate tone of someone sharing family stories rather than delivering conference presentations. He said that the earth speaks to those who know how to listen, but that listening requires patience, respect, and the willingness to hear answers that might challenge everything you think you understand about what's possible. The words carried weight that extended beyond their immediate context, offering wisdom that resonated with environmental scientists studying climate change, economic development specialists working in resource-constrained communities, and political leaders grappling with the complex relationships between economic growth and environmental sustainability. Elena had established a scholarship program at the University of Arizona that supported students interested in combining traditional ecological knowledge with modern scientific research methods. The program attracted applicants from indigenous communities throughout the Americas, creating educational opportunities that honored both ancestral wisdom and contemporary academic rigor, while addressing practical challenges related to sustainable resource development. The Elena Morales Institute for Intuitive Resource Development had become an unlikely academic institution where researchers studied the psychological and cultural factors that enabled some individuals to recognize opportunities that trained experts overlooked. The Institute's interdisciplinary approach attracted faculty from fields ranging from cognitive psychology to anthropology, each contributing insights about the complex relationships between knowledge, intuition, and the willingness to act on possibilities that seemed improbable to conventional thinking. The Vasquez Foundation has now supported over 200 projects in 43 countries, Maria continued. And while not all of them have succeeded, the ones that have succeeded have created models for community-controlled resource development that prioritize local benefit over external profit extraction. We've learned that the most sustainable projects are usually the ones where communities maintain ownership and control over their natural resources. The Foundation's success rate, roughly 30% of funded projects yielding positive results, compared favorably with venture capital investments while supporting initiatives that traditional investors would have considered too risky or insufficiently profitable. The Foundation's approach emphasized community capacity building and environmental stewardship over short-term financial returns, creating development models that address both economic and social sustainability. Carmen had become an international consultant on family business management, helping other families navigate the complex relationships between sudden wealth and existing family dynamics. Her presentations at business schools focused on practical strategies for maintaining family cohesion while adapting to dramatic changes in financial circumstances, offering insights that estate planning attorneys and family wealth consultants found valuable for serving clients whose circumstances had changed dramatically. I think the most important lesson we've learned, Maria said, approaching the conclusion of her presentation, is that the Earth's secrets aren't just geological, they're also about human potential, about the extraordinary things that become possible when people are supported rather than discouraged for trusting their instincts about opportunities that seem impossible to conventional thinking. The standing ovation that followed was sustained and genuine, recognition that Maria's story offered hope that transcended its specific circumstances to address universal themes about courage, persistence, and the willingness to pursue possibilities that existed at the intersection of vision and faith.
Her presentation would be quoted in economics textbooks, cited in environmental policy discussions, and referenced in graduate student dissertations about sustainable resource extraction for decades to come. After the conference concluded, Maria and Diego walked through Geneva's Old Town. Their conversation ranged across topics that reflected the international perspective they'd developed through 5 years of global travel and cross-cultural collaboration. Diego's facility with languages and his comfort in international settings suggested a future that might include diplomatic service or international development work, though he'd also expressed interest in geological engineering and cave exploration.
"Mama," Diego said, as they paused beside Lake Geneva to watch sunlight dance across water that seemed impossibly blue compared to the desert landscapes of their childhood. "Do you think Grandpa knew what would happen when he taught you to listen to the earth?" Maria considered the question, her mind ranging across the years that had transformed their lives from economic uncertainty to global recognition. Her grandfather's stories about hidden water and buried treasure had proven literally prophetic, but his deeper wisdom about trusting inherited knowledge and respecting natural systems had provided guidance that extended far beyond their specific circumstances. "I think he knew that the earth keeps secrets that are more valuable than money," Maria replied, watching tourboats navigate waters that reflected alpine peaks and urban architecture in equal measure. "But I also think he understood that the most important secrets are about human courage, about the extraordinary things that become possible when people are brave enough to trust their deepest instincts about what might be possible." As they returned to their hotel, passing through streets where multiple languages created a symphony of international commerce and cultural exchange, Maria reflected on the journey that had led from a desperate gamble in the Arizona desert to recognition as someone whose insights about sustainable development deserved attention from world leaders and policymakers. The transformation hadn't been simple or straightforward. Success had brought obligations, opportunities, and complications that she couldn't have anticipated during those first terrifying days when the drilling rig tilted into the sinkhole and their dreams seemed to be collapsing into expensive disaster. But the core insight that had driven her to spend her last $500 on worthless desert land, that sometimes the most valuable treasures were hidden in places where conventional wisdom said they couldn't exist, had proven applicable to challenges far beyond their personal circumstances. Tomorrow they would return to Arizona, to the desert property that had become a research station and the cave system that continued producing both water and rare earth elements, while supporting scientific investigations that contributed to global understanding of sustainable resource extraction. Diego would resume his studies at the research station's educational facility, where he learned alongside graduate students and visiting scientists, while maintaining the connection to desert landscapes that had shaped his childhood. Elena would be waiting for them at the Phoenix airport, her 79-year-old energy still focused on foundation projects and educational initiatives that supported people whose dreams exceeded their financial resources. Carmen would have updates about the latest extraction operations and community development projects, along with stories about new applications to the foundation from people around the world who'd heard about the woman who'd found treasure in impossible places. But as Maria watched the sunset over Lake Geneva, painting the water in colors that reminded her of Arizona sunsets over landscapes that had revealed their most precious secrets to a woman brave enough to dig deeper than anyone expected, she understood that the most meaningful treasure had been the discovery that ordinary people could trust their extraordinary instincts about possibilities that seemed impossible until someone made them real. The earth, as her grandfather had promised, truly did speak to those who knew how to listen. And sometimes, if you listened carefully enough and courageously enough, it revealed secrets that changed not just your life, but the lives of countless others who needed to believe that impossible dreams could contain the most precious forms of truth. What an absolutely incredible journey! Maria's $500 gamble turned into a $140 million discovery that changed everything. If this story inspired you to never give up on your dreams, please hit that like button, share this with everyone you know, and subscribe for more amazing stories of ordinary people achieving extraordinary things. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.